All right, welcome to the Geopolitics and the Occult panel. My name is Zack Payne, joined on stage with Ghost of Bass Patrick Henry, Matt Ehret, and of course, Burning Bright down there. Good to see you, my friend.
Why'd you say it that way?
I didn't realize I said it anyway, but... So this is obviously an interesting concept for a panel because geopolitics is something that often gets talked about, and I think that occult... The concept of the occult is intrinsically tied to politics and, the larger global platform. But occult in and of itself as like a concept is really like hidden, secret information. And even though there is a lot of secret information inside, government machinations, doesn't necessarily mean that it's all of the same caliber of stuff. I look at the founding of the United States of America, and you can look at the design of Washington, D.C., and clearly there's a lot of occult symbolism present in there. Look at our money. There's obviously occult symbols there. We talk about the occult a lot in terms of the evil of this world and how people who are in the structures of power are obviously tied into evil occult things. But occult as a concept, again, is just secret. It doesn't necessarily mean evil. And knowledge itself throughout history has often been kept in secret. And for a long time, average people were not even allowed to write. We weren't allowed to put things down into hard form, and everything was passed down generation to generation through oral history and tradition. And so if you didn't have the benefit of receiving that information from somebody, then it would remain secret to you. And a lot of it was kept under lock and key, specifically within secret societies. And I see the occult playing out a lot on the global stage in the sense that the people who are looking at it from a nefarious perspective often time world events and important happenings in relation to their own occult beliefs and where they would like to see things go. So yeah, I guess maybe that's just the way to kick it off.
Yeah, but, well, you actually were mentioning before about would you talk for a minute about the founding fathers?
Yes.
And some of the ideas around that.
Well, the founding fathers, many of them were part of secret societies. I mean, obviously the plans and the decision making happening behind the scenes had to remain secret because they had a lot to worry about in terms of people perhaps taking information back to Britain. But the knowledge itself has always remained hidden and secret because in that way they can safeguard it and protect it. And I think there's also sort of an underlying attitude even today about the common man versus like the educated and the elite and keeping certain levels of information back. And obviously that has resulted in a lot of interest in those specific subjects, in occult and in hidden information.
And Matt, and I know that you have a great deal of knowledge when it comes to this. Could you talk a few minutes about the founding fathers, some of the misconceptions with Freemasonry, and elucidate that topic for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's really fun that we're doing this panel. I didn't expect that this topic was going to be selected, but it's really important too, right? Because as you pointed out, a big part of our history, I would say all of it, can't really be properly accounted for if we want to satisfy the deeper question of like why things happen. If you don't go towards recognizing the often causal influence of secret societies, of the occult, for good or for bad. And I think a lot of people that I've met, and I'm sure a lot of people here, have encountered truth seekers who, upon realizing the importance of Freemasonry in the founding of the Republic, quickly become blackpilled and jump to the opposite, the extreme conclusion that the entire revolution was a fraud run by Freemasonic secret societies that ultimately are just playing a long game to entrap us and blah blah blah, and they become very, very cynical very easily. And I think there's an important nuance that's being missed, which is that within the institution of Freemasonic lodges, there is a lot of evidence of a long-standing battle between different factions that have different worldviews, different ways of thinking about God, human beings, government, law, that are completely irreconcilable. And like when you look at the, I mean, for one example is Ben Franklin and Jefferson and Washington and so many others were Freemasons. It's true, but part of it, like you just pointed out, was practical, that if you're going to maintain a global conspiracy, because it was global, you had networks in Russia and France and Germany, even India, working together to make the American Revolution happen. That requires a lot of, again, you don't have the internet, you don't have cell phones, you don't have any, it's very difficult to pass on sensitive communication, so the lodge system became a useful tool, practically speaking, for just communicating information. Ciphers, very important tool to communicate information as well.
Cryptography is what you're talking about.
Yeah, cryptography.
Encryption,
yeah. This has been done since ancient times. You know, you couldn't reveal, your plans, your secrets, even like military secrets, which is a driving force of much of the sciences has been historically through military endeavors. You have to keep certain things secret by necessity, or else your enemy will undo what you're trying to get accomplished. And then the other thing is that the actual, I read a book from 1978, which really helped me a lot, called The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites, and it was written by a now deceased philosopher named Lyndon LaRouche. And in it, he did in a fantastic way, I never thought possible, he illustrated the two opposing epistemological worldviews of the Platonic and the Aristotelian faction of the elites, which have had irreconcilable views that have been clashing throughout history.
You're referring to Aristotle and Plato, or Aristotle and Plato, rather, right?
Aristotle, what did I say?
Yeah. No. You
said it right.
You said it right. You said it right. I was just referring to Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, where Aristotle, who's commonly told, passed on as the student of Plato, is actually representing an insurrectionary, anti-Platonic ideology that was infused into the Platonic Academy when Plato was very old. And if you actually look at the way of view of both men, one does represent an oligarchist idea of human nature as being something that has no soul. Humans are a blank slate to be written on by the elite. That law is something which is imposed from an unmoved mover, a creator that is impotent but is a tyrannical force, because the Aristotelian creator created laws but is impotent to be able to improve upon the creation. So in that world, those who actually have power are those who can simply impose their interpretation onto the society that will then be more obedient by being blank slates or like human computers. Whereas the Platonic faction had a very different idea that there's an innate soul in all of us that yearns for perfectibility, that can co-create with the creator. And the two factions in Freemasonry could really be, on first approximation, defined by those two schools. And the founding fathers definitely had a much more Platonic view in that sense, that they believed that there is inalienable rights that emerge from within because we're made in the image of the creator. We're not blank slates, we're not machines in that sense. And there was evidence of a purge, a battle that purged a lot of the Republican Masonic institutions throughout the 19th century, so that they lost a lot of their influence coming into the 20th century, though they still had some influence, but a lot less. And a lot of that was begun in the 1825 to 1840 purging of those lodges.
Speaking of Plato, I wasn't expecting to talk about Plato, but I think it's actually interesting because a lot of what we talk about, especially I think Chris and I talk about quite a bit, narrative, obviously that was a great discussion earlier about a lot of that. And Plato versus Aristotle is actually kind of interesting, and I think adjacent to that sort of argument that we often deploy that is more and more popular, which is that we're not being cute when we say that the story is more important than the actual, the narrative is more important than the actual. We're being very literal. And I think Plato, I've always felt, was saying something similar. He's sort of saying, truth is an inherent thing, but truth is not, you can't hold it, right? It's not an actual, it's in the realm of ideas, and was very consumed with the world should be, and human nature really should be spilling out from, radiating out from these first principles, ideas, whereas Aristotle was very mechanistic, and like, if we can learn how to describe something and all of its nuance and detail, we can understand it much better. Now, like, obviously, I think that there's advantages to understanding mechanistically how things work. I remember even in university indoctrination school, they used to describe, they would present Aristotle as the evolution of Plato, or I thought he was the devolution of Plato, no pun intended. But they used to use an example of a lion. So there's a real or storified debate between Plato and Aristotle about how would you describe the ideal lion. And Aristotle said, you go find one and look at one, and that's the ideal lion, the actual, right? And Plato argued that the idea of a lion is an enduring, eternal, permanent idea, and that you could actually never find a perfect lion in the realm of the real, in actual, but you could conceptualize one. And the reason he thought that was important to distinguish is that that's the sort of inspiration for all great human ingenuity, right? People are inspired by looking at actual things, but when you create something new, you are following the Platonic sort of pathway of iterating, of ideating, of creating an idea. And Aristotle, you'd never get there by just repeating things. Oh, I saw this thing, let's make it more efficient and more efficient and more efficient. And to bring this back into the occult, I think it's interesting because what these secret societies and the occult and everything, I think, have in common, the first note I'd kind of written down when thinking about what could I talk about here is, I think when you think about ideas, the occult is often stripped out of the conversation. It's put in this like silo because people feel odd talking about it, or it's kind of unwieldy. And I think when you consider the occult and secret societies, good, bad, and everywhere in between, you start getting much closer to the why behind the why. It's not, so much of our geopolitics is explained to us, as you were talking about earlier, as a cause and effect, like all causal relationships, right? Russia did this, so Ukraine responded with this, like this mechanistic worldview. When really, if you understand the intent to begin with, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin I've been talking about recently, right? Something happened there that people disagree about, and then there was a reaction to it that led us into this war, right? But if you're thinking platonically, you would think people in secret already had an idea of what they wanted to do. It didn't really matter what actually happened to kick off the chain of events that they wanted to perpetuate. So in that example, it is more important to understand the ideas and the occult, the people who are ideating toward an end goal, than it is to understand who shot who from which boat that led to the deaths of millions of people.
The secret idea gave birth to the narrative, which led to the war and led us to the history books.
Got him.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know we were going to go in this direction, but I love it. So Plato is the teacher of Aristotle. The teacher of Plato is Socrates. The Socratic method is what a lot of us have become familiar with. Socrates famously said, "The only thing I know for certain is that I know nothing," demonstrating his humility, even though he was widely considered the wisest person alive. And yeah, it's about asking questions. And as Matt explained on one of our recent episodes of Breaking History, Socrates was known for going, kind of leaning into what Cam and I were discussing, walking right up to the elites in ancient Greece and challenging them and saying, here's what the standard is, here's what the established idea is, explain it to me, debate. Like, let's cut through all the noise and let's just have the discussion. And he would humiliate these people by doing that. Imagine going up to, name your politician, and just cutting through all the noise and asking him a first principles question and humiliating them like on camera, right? If we were able to do that over and over and over again, we would very quickly weed these people out. Of course, they ended up executing him for speaking truth, and they even told him, if you just denounce everything you've ever said, we will let you live, and he said, I can't do that, and so they killed him. The student then, so you have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. The student then of Aristotle is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, of course, was known for taking up his father's ambition of conquering the entire Greek Empire, conquering the Greeks from Macedonia, and then continuing in the course of about 2 years, conquered everything from Western Greece all the way to India and down through Egypt very quickly. And then, of course, died young. Interestingly enough, one of the things that he's kind of known for is bridging East and West culturally. He had a deep fascination of Eastern culture. He was very intrigued by it, and particularly like the Iranian, Persian area. MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, at like 16 years old, told all of his cousins that he was going to be the next Alexander the Great. Like that was his like ambition, was to bridge East and West and bring those cultures together. So I think that's like a full circle. Let's bring this all back to geopolitics and the occult. But
yeah, that was very artfully done. But yeah, I would just add one little point of discontinuity there, because in my reading, it seems like Aristotle, though he did begin as the tutor of Alexander, Alexander did fire him and accused him of trying to brainwash him.
There you go.
And
based.
Yeah. And it was Aristotle's nephew who was condemned by the generals surviving Alexander for poisoning Alexander. So it seems like Aristotle might have had a more direct role in Alexander's youthful, convenient death. And Xenophon, though, who did represent the more true method of Plato in opposition to Aristotle, did end up teaching Alexander after Aristotle was expelled. So it seemed like you had, and one of the things he did is he had written a book on the life of Cyrus the Great, which inspired Alexander, who wanted to live up to the ideals, at least as was recounted in Xenophon's Life of Cyrus the Great, of those ideals, which kind of brings it back to
the morning benediction mentions Cyrus the Great. Yeah,
right.
This is why we love to have Matt on stage at GART, because he can give us those insights, right?
But we're saying Aristotle's deep state, I think.
Aristotle's deep state, that is the
Aristotle's
point. That's the lesson. But yeah, and just to say before passing it on, I think that the idea that ideas govern material reality, because we have ideas and material reality, right? Physics and metaphysics, but it's which one leads in the dance. They coexist. We have a physical aspect of ourselves, but where does the I, where is it located individually, and in all principles, right? A materialist would begin, if they were using the Aristotelian method of focusing on the mechanics, looking for the question of what causes the rabbit to be alive. The first thing that this scientist would do typically would be kill the rabbit and dissect the rabbit, and then the thing you're looking for is long gone, and they don't realize it because they think the whole is the sum of the parts. Now, the person thinking from the standpoint of Plato that the ideas lead in the dance, that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, that there's something additional, transcendental, right? And I think that those who say that there's no such things as, that anybody who believes in conspiracy theories is a kook, you should stop listening to them right away, they're basically saying, I don't believe in higher ideas causing things. That's what they've been brainwashed to think.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think this is where the philosophers erred, is to have the rigidity that they did. To think that it's always either or, this dichotomy, you can only go one way or the other, because it's obviously a lot more nuanced when you get into the living of these things, and really start dissecting them. Because without the full complement of both ideas and really understanding things from both angles, you lose one path and you don't understand how something is working. As you said, you kill the rabbit, the soul is gone, you're never going to find what it was that drove the rabbit to live in the first place. Mm-hmm. And we see it a lot in modern day with the decisions between Russia or Ukraine, the West and the East, communism or the Allies. The whole thing.
He activated me. Yeah. Those were the activation words.
Do it.
No, I think to start tying this into that's a lot of good big picture setup. I think I think Plato framed it as forms and ideals. That's how he thought of the world. But to tie this into kind of why these things have an effect now, obviously I'm very interested in the Ukraine-Russia narrative. It's kind of what got me into the info war. And I think that we can later on maybe talk about positive examples of this, as we were saying with Occult. But as a negative, again, people think of trying to find the mechanism, trying to understand why something is happening by examining the mechanisms at play, right? So even if you're not, a retarded leftist who thinks that Russia are, Putin's Hitler, et cetera, and the Ukrainians are Luke Skywalker against the evil empire. If you're trying to, what the community I often say that I actually get more annoyed with, because you just can dismiss people like that, right? They're idiots. But the OSINT community, I don't know if people are kind of familiar with that term, a lot of them on Twitter, open source intelligence. I can't stand them because what they do is they go, we're not going to listen to the media. We're going to find out what's actually happening, right? So that's an example of, those are Aristotle sort of, they might have good intentions. We're going to figure out what's happening by examining the events that are occurring. So, of course, what they're doing at that point is they're showing you satellite imagery to talk about troop movements that are being provided to them by governments that are lying about everything that's happening, right? But they're doing open source, and we went right to the source, which is the government. But we don't believe the government, right? So that's one problem with it. But another problem, I think, is that, take Russia-Ukraine, for example. How many normies do you know that are aware of the underlying claim being forwarded, right? We think of a court case, and what's a court case? Somebody is forwarding a claim, and somebody else is defending themselves from the claim. The story in the central narrative is Russia invaded Ukraine because they think it should be Russian, and Ukraine thinks it should be Ukrainian, right? That is not the claim being forwarded. That's a fifth-order effect of the claim. The claim being forwarded by Vladimir Putin is, Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, is a Nazi regime that we are purging from what should be the Russian Federation and what always has been the Russian Federation. That's the claim. He said it's a denazification effort, right? Obviously, the counterclaim becomes, no, we're not Nazis, okay? And just to pass this on, but I wanna show an example of this. The New York Times, this is an article, this is a headline from July 2nd, 2022. So again, you do not need to read articles. All you need to do is read headlines, and you'll get plenty. Read mine, though. Mine are really good. So headline. I just rugged myself. How the Russian media spread false claims about Ukrainian Nazis. Okay, so they're like, ooh, we see some people talking about Nazis. We should tell them that that's all fake. All right? How the Russian media spread false claims about Ukrainian Nazis. Let's look at a different source, the New York Times, again. And this was 2023. Headline, Nazi symbols on Ukraine's front lines highlight thorny issue of Ukrainian history. So one of the things I say a lot on the shows is, does the truth become the truth once it's discovered, or was it already there the whole time, right? And then we're trying to find out what it is. Now, which claim being forwarded is closer to the truth that we are now being told by the media? Does it seem like Putin was telling more of the truth about there's a big Nazi problem in Ukraine? And now the New York Times is saying, I mean, Ukraine's still great, but except for that Nazi problem. And I'll pass it on, but one more point on the Nazis is they're steeped in occult, right? That their whole thing is occult. I think the reason the media doesn't want to touch it is because it starts to, if you start pulling that thread of, hold on, the Ukrainians are Nazis? Well, yes, they are, actually. Well, where did that start? And why were we funding them against the and who are the Bushes? And, you know, like that's, and you only get there, not if you're trying to figure out how many troop movements satellite images are showing you. You're just looking at what are the claims being forwarded, and where's the story going?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously you can pull that thread all the way back to World War II, you know, and as soon as people do that, it becomes like this major mind-altering moment, because nobody wants to think they're supporting Nazis, except for, I guess, modern-day leftists. I mean, because it's undeniable at this point, you know? And so, you know, obviously the message from New York Times is, okay, so there are Nazis, but it's not nearly as bad as Putin said it is. And even if there are Nazis, we're supporting them against Russia, so it's okay. There are Nazis, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just wild. It's so wild. Yeah, I guess the thing I'll just throw in there, and you raised the issue that when you start pulling on the Nazi question, one of the reasons why I think that people have why this has been allowed to happen is because we didn't really defeat the Nazis after World War II, though we've been told, right? Yeah.
He said it.
Yeah. And Victory Day is coming up. It's probably time that we revisit that question, you know? But yeah, you actually start looking at, well, what did these leading SS officers do after World War II? Yeah, a couple were thrown under the bus. A couple of like sacrifices were made, maybe 20 or 30 at Nuremberg were hung. A few lower level doctors and jurors. But by and large, the leading Nazi SS inner elite that were part of the Thule Society black magician class that were like doing demon worshipping in like Wewelsburg Castle under Heinrich Himmler's like New Templar order of child murderers, like most of them continued on to have great careers with the CIA and MI6 managing NATO's secret armies after World War II. Like that sounds crazy what I just said, but it's all verifiably true. Some of them went on to advise the Mossad. You know, after what's his name? Scorsese. Oswald Scorsese, yeah.
Scorsese, yeah, Scorsese, yeah.
Or something.
Not going to work here anymore.
Otto Scorsese, yeah. Hitler's top killer was given a job advising the Mossad in the 1960s, or after 1951. You know,
hunting down and killing Nazi scientists who were working for the Soviets and the Arabs.
Ironically, right? Yeah. But lawful.
His old countrymen, his old friends.
Yeah. So that's part of, I think, the reason where, you know, you had now several generations of this going on, nobody dealt with this, and of course, many of those who had been working directly with Stefan Bandera in Ukraine, the leading Ukrainian Nazi that was collaborating with Hitler, they were given jobs writing textbooks to shape the minds of young Ukrainians, especially expats in Canada and more broadly, about what World War II was about and how Hitler was maybe not the bad guy in World War II. So of course, now they've got like, you know, third generation grandkids of those you know, people who were working with Hitler, who, surprise, surprise, are part of the Svoboda and Pravi Sector and C-14 neo-Nazi organizations, because they've been conditioned by the textbooks that were funded by our taxpayer money in the United States, right? It's part of the thing.
Yeah, and you know, things become even stickier when you realize that a lot of that Igor Kolomoisky, who created the Azov Battalion in 2014, pictures of him in 2014 wearing a shirt in Ukrainian that says Hebrew Banderites, and that all of these militias, these Nazi militias that fly the flag of Stepan Bandera and have swastikas, and many of them worship Hitler, are also all Jewish, and they have the Star of David printed on Stepan Bandera, like the Banderite flag. And that creates a lot of questions in a lot of people's minds. What the hell is going on in Ukraine? And what the hell is going on in history and what we've been taught? And there's obviously more to the story than what we've been told. And I don't have the answers. I mean, these are answers. These are things we should all explore as a group. But, you know, a lot of the debate online right now wants to make everything about World War II and Hitler versus the Jews and that whole dynamic, and it's one side or the other. And then you introduce this really, really inconvenient fact.
Irony, yeah.
Yeah, irony that you have Jewish Nazis in Ukraine that are direct apparent descendants of Stepan Bandera. What is that about?
It begs the question. I mean, we know about them. We know about the Nazis who came over here with Project Paperclip and integrated into the fabric of the federal government. We know about many that went to Russia. Clearly, some of them didn't make it. But how many of them took on new Jewish identities and maybe found their way to Israel and became, you know, something else entirely?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just add one thing. You guys know about the Havara Agreement, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No. Explain.
It's worth Googling, but to be very quick about it, this is the 1933 agreement between Nazi Germany and the British Empire to start getting as many Jews from Europe into the desert as possible. I think 80,000 or so were basically given full government paid, you know, flights or I guess boat trips to now live in the desert. But it was Eichmann who was studying the Kabbalah. He taught himself Hebrew to study the Kabbalah, that Adolf Eichmann, who was overseeing that program, as part of some weird, mystical, esoteric belief that seems to have been in play even back then, that some form of new age, end times reset of humanity could be ushered in to have like a 1,000-year Reich, you know, or what Aleister Crowley, who was also very deeply embedded within high-level Nazi commanders through his disciple J.C.F. Fuller, who was the head of the Astrum Argentum Lodge that Crowley had set up. That was his back channel to Hitler directly to bring in the Thelemic philosophy into the inner core. He had the idea of creating a 1,000-year age of Horus to usher in through a cataclysmic event, right? some form of New Age. And you had a left-hand, right-hand path going about doing that. But people, again, Oswald Mosley. Fuller was Oswald Mosley's key lieutenant. Who's Oswald Mosley? He was a Theosophist, a Fabian Society, and the head of the National Socialist Party of Great Britain, who was the Führer of England. He had a whole program in order to, create an Anglo-Nazi world empire under that would be the New World Order of 1945. That was supposed to happen. Didn't work out because certain patriots were able to play a very big role to disrupt that agenda. But it was tied to what Crowley was trying to do then. And it disturbs me that many of Crowley's followers who think that they're the reincarnation of Crowley and spoke about that, like Colonel Michael Aquino, who believes that he is the reincarnation of Crowley and did.
There's a real Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, look at Google a picture of Michael Aquino, and it's the most evil-looking guy. Like,
You will never see somebody who has put more effort into grooming their eyebrows as that guy. But he did weird Babylon workings in Wewelsburg Castle to honor Himmler. That's what he was doing in 1978 when he was trying to usher in the age of Seth. So you got these people who had an inordinate amount of influence in things like the revolution in military affairs that turned America's military into more of an instrument that became a vanguard of a new sort of mercenary class of crusader types that would usher in things like Desert Storm, the post 9/11 age, and other things. This was made possible through largely the efforts of Michael Aquino. So that's like a big piece of bizarre, disturbing influence that we have to also take ownership of before we can actually start dealing with the consequences of that.
And again, I think all that's a great context, and I think we're never pretending that we know what the answers are, as we've been saying here. But sometimes I think people can get overwhelmed with that, right? They're like, all right, if I can't trust the actuals, and if a lot of the narratives are lies, then you're kind of taking Russia on faith or Ukraine on faith as this example, because it's the current Nazi storyline, because we haven't quite gotten the disclosure on the Israeli side yet, which is coming, but. I think that you can start to get the direction of who is forwarding a truer story based on who is talking about things like these. And I don't know if you saw Dmitry Medvedev. He's one of the fun reads out of Russia. But he said that it's a joke to believe that that the United States has any standing to negotiate on behalf of Ukraine. And now I believe that there is an alliance between the U.S. and Russia, and obviously, but people will look at statements like that and think, that seems anti-American. No, what he's doing is isolating a Nazi regime, and he used the word Führer. I don't know how to pronounce it, right? But he said, until they're looking to appoint a new Führer, and only that person can negotiate with us directly. Ukraine is going to have to come to the table and negotiate their surrender with us. And when you see that kind of rhetoric, if you're a normie who has no idea that Ukraine is full of Nazis, was installed by Nazis, managed by Nazis, et cetera, again, doesn't mean all of Ukraine, but Eastern Ukraine for sure. When you understand that the CIA, this loops all the way back around, it's an Ouroboros pattern. The CIA was founded by Nazis. The Bushes are Nazis. Like, we all kind of know this, right? It's kind of common knowledge in this room, not really outside of it.
Prescott Bush was arrested in 1943 for trading with the Enemies Act.
Yes.
For participating in the Third Reich.
Very literally Nazis. Very literally not like, oh, the figurative, they're kind of like, no, they're Nazis. They're actual Nazis, right? So you consider that, and now let's go back to 2014, speaking of actuals. Who overthrew the pro-Russian regime in Ukraine? The CIA. Under Barack Obama, right? So who overthrew the Russian regime in Ukraine? Nazis. Yeah. And who did they replace them with? Nazis. Yeah. And now the New York Times calling them Nazis. And to make another point, kind of loop back to what I said before, when you start understanding that, I actually don't get discouraged by it. To me, it assigns, once you understand that there is a deeply rooted belief system at the core of the evil that we are fighting against, if you think of things too mechanistically, which is my problem with the OSINT guys, besides the fact that you can't prove anything you're looking at, they're just thinking cause and effect. Well, it's all incentive structures, and who wants the money in the oil? Like, the idea that the Middle Eastern war was all about oil is ridiculous. It's patently absurd. There was a lot more going on besides oil, and part of it was perpetuating this massive controlled opposition dynamic of radicalizing Islam, so then we could say that Islam had been radicalized and was a threat to us, right? Also done by the Nazis. So when you understand the ideology behind the events that are happening, it turns out the world is not chaotic. It's very coordinated and planned, but the second and third order effects of that planning seems like chaos. It seems like total chaos. I think once you understand that it was planned, then it makes more sense. You have a question?
Yeah, this is for Ghost and Matt mostly, but along the lines of what BB we just got done saying was the Muslim Brotherhood was heavily involved in all of that situation. I was just wondering if you guys could elaborate on that.
Well, as far as Ukraine goes, I'm not sure how the Muslim Brotherhood is tied in, and MI6 would be the connection. But I would say this, that BB mentions, and this might be kind of long-winded how Muslim Brotherhood comes in, but Maidan coup of 2014, they install a guy as an interim president for about 6 months, whose name escapes me, but he was a Ukrainian intelligence officer who is part of what is called the Ukrainian-Israeli Mafia. In 2010, he was arrested by the Ukrainian government for destroying all the files on his mob boss, a guy named Mogolovich. And Mogolovich is considered, his nickname is the Big Brain. He's considered the the head of the Ukrainian-Israeli Mafia. And what's interesting about Mogolovich is I was reading a book by Gordon Thomas, Israel Super Spy, the story of Robert Maxwell. This is the father of Ghislaine Maxwell. And in the 1980s, when it was understood by the US and the Soviets and everyone that the Soviet government was going to collapse, all of the oligarchs in Ukraine started making plans for how they were going to integrate into the Western financial system and basically convert the Soviet Union into capitalism. And a lot of them went to Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell helped a lot of them launder their money out of Ukraine, launder it out of the Soviet Union. And he told them, he said, look, the country that has the most lax banking regulations in the world is Israel, because they are trying to promote money being sent there. They want people to invest in Israel, so they have very lax banking regulations. Use Israel to launder the money. And one of his #1 clients in doing that, or the people he helped the most, was a guy named Mogolovich. So the guy who ended up plugging in the interim president, his lieutenant, who became the interim president in Ukraine in 2014 after the Maidan coup, was the #1 guy that Robert Maxwell, father of Ghislaine Maxwell, helped get out of Ukraine, launder his money into the West, and basically remain a major mob boss. This guy established massive child trafficking networks, Mogolovich, okay? So all of this stuff is connected. I don't know how Mogolovich connects to Jeffrey Epstein outside of Robert Maxwell, but I have to imagine that it's not a coincidence that connection exists.
Very interesting. On the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood side of things, I think one of the most useful jump-off points on that doesn't really play into what you're. But I'm going to approach it from a totally different angle that ties in both the weird esoteric underpinnings under Zionism, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood sort of radicalization and perversion of Islam that were then used to play off each other. And something similar happened to Christianity. So I don't think like we're untouched by this problem of Satanists infiltrating and then acting Christian to get wars, right? But go back to 1090, right at the emergence of the First Crusade, you had the Templars, the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar that were co-created, right? One became known today as the Knights of Malta. The other one was put down in 1312, but then went into a few different iterations in the ensuing centuries, one of those iterations being the Jesuits that emerged in 1535. But all that to say, the Templars had modeled themselves off of the pre-existing order of Hashashins, the order that had been set up in 1090 as a Batiniya order of a certain sect within Islam, within a certain Sufi sect of actually Ismaili Nizaris, or Nizari Ismailis, that were led by a figure named Hassan Isaba, the old man of the mountain. Marco Polo had met one of his grand masters a century later. And this Hashashin order is sort of, I think, the root of the ideology that created and was used later on by the Salafist faction in the 1890s, people, the followers of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who were sort of working with the British Empire to radicalize Islam in order to undermine the Ottoman Empire, which is what they did during World War I and a little bit, and then afterwards. But so Hassani Sabah, part of the order of the Hashashins, the reason why they got that, that's the root of the name Assassins. If people play video games and they play Assassin's Creed, there's actually a video game that has a lot of reality in it. It's quite sophisticated. But part of the idea was you would get high as a kite in a sacred ceremony involving like sacred use of drugs in order to then go and be deployed in an altered state to go and carry out a hit of some target. Often those targets were Muslims. That there were Muslims like, what's his name? Peacemaker.
Bin Salman?
No, 1175, Third Crusade.
Oh yeah, obviously.
Gordon knows. The great.
Muhammad bin Muhammad. Shafiqa.
Oh, it'll come to me later. It's fine.
It'll come to us in a second, but yeah.
Jafar.
You're throwing me off, man. I was on the tip of my tongue. Saladin the Great.
Yeah.
Saladin the Great.
Okay, of course. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
I thought she meant Al-Rashin, not Al-Rashin, but Saladin.
Saladin, yeah. Saladin was a Muslim leader who had avoided 2 assassination attempts by these assassins, these Hashashins. And he caught some of the assassins for the second attempt. He interrogated them, and it was discovered that it was the Templars who had hired him to kill him, hired these assassins to kill the guy in order to keep the Forever Wars going. So the Crusaders, the crusading Gnostic Templars, were working with their seeming enemies to keep the Forever Wars going. It's part of the game, and I think that, and part of their headquarters was Solomon's Temple. That's where the Templars, they're the Knights of Solomon's Temple. And that was their headquarters in the Solomon's Mines, which they had an idea of doing what Julian the Apostate was trying to do, and didn't work out for Julian, but they were trying to do it again, which is create the Third Solomon Temple to usher in some new age, in some mystical purgative violence that would bring in a new kind of humanity. And it seems like that's sort of in play. That was behind the creation of Zionism. It was behind the creation of Salafism. The Muslim Brotherhood has Salafism in many ways as an influence within its paradigm, as well as Wahhabism. So yeah, that's how the game. There's a formula, though.
So Matt got all this by watching the Kingdom of Heaven episode of Story Hour with Saladin. I was just trying to see if he was watching. I want to kind of spin this, maybe pass it to Zack next, because you were kind of talking about something similar before the panel. But this sounds very dark and negative, right? I can kind of spin all of this as a strange positive, which sort of helped pull me out of a lot of depression when I used to dig into this stuff, right? We've talked about that, I think, where when you first start digging into stuff, you're like, man, that too, and that guy too, and this too, and the controlled opposition dynamic is a huge thing. I think even these what you're describing there is similar attempts that you and Chris kind of tangentially touched on with the reason people like us can get a lot of flack for calling out what we perceive as attempts to rebrand MAGA, right? Like J6ers and Proud Boys, and people will defend them and everything. And this is a lot of the stuff that we've got the context in our heads of saying, yeah, if they can't beat you, then they don't join you, they change you. They want to change MAGA into being the thing that they have branded it as. So if they can't convince everybody that MAGA, which is not that thing, is that thing, they will make it that thing. And they will, get all these people. It used to blow my mind how many people would get mad that we would say, some of the J6ers were, deserved it. And then in the next sentence, they'd go, well, it was infiltrators that caused all this stuff. You say, yeah, who do you think got arrested? Right? Like, again, I'm not saying you could have it either way. I'm sure there's both. But to make this positive, because I said I would, all of these examples, I think, demonstrate that most of the world's problems that we think of are entirely engineered by a very small number of people. The good thing about that, the white pill in that, I think, is that if you understand that, you can start to break out of maybe the core programming that hits us from the time we're children, which is that human nature is inherently evil and self-serving, right? Like, Governments want us to believe that human beings need to be organized and given a set of rules, because if they don't, this is the kind of stuff that happens. You see what happens.
We're a cancer causing global warming.
Yeah, we're a cancer. That's my generation of programming is, they stopped trying to tell you, they moved on from a lot of the previous programming, and then it just became like, oh no, there's nothing you can do about it. You are born inherently evil as a scourge on the earth. So to wrap it positive, when you understand that these small groups and small plans become these mass chaotic situations, forever wars, etc., if you can start at that first order effect and stop it, then the world, I think this is why we see this community is attracted to figures like Trump. Besides what you think of his specific plans, his rhetoric is, I think, revolutionary, where he came in and said, make America great again. Well, inherent in that slogan is a belief that it can be made great again, and a belief that it was great. Now in his next term, it's the golden age, right? And people make fun of that who don't get into this stuff, but he's the first leader, outside of Vladimir Putin, ironically, that is talking about a golden age of humanity that is possible to go into if we just figure our crap out and stop people from creating forever wars. You've never seen a president whose most controversial statement seems to be about wanting people to make peace deals together, right? It's incredible. It's like, you can disagree with the manner in which he goes about things or whatever, but I think the posture of the administration right now, ironically, is a warlike posture for peace and for a rebalancing of global trade. And this is why when I talk to people and they say, oh, he's being too chaotic about trade deals, being disrespectful. Who's he being disrespectful for? Globalist regime puppets and other there's no more negotiations happening. This is the way it's going to be. We're going in this direction because this direction is morally good. It's the good direction to go in. And I think, maybe there's good secret societies involved in some of that stuff, right?
Absolutely. I think that the reason I absolutely love Donald Trump is because of his honesty and his candor. I appreciate the fact that he is willing to stand up to those people, because many of them may have public, excellent decorum, okay? They can be very polite, but then behind the scenes in those secret meetings, they're plotting the ways that they can destroy you and destroy society and how they can plunder all of the riches from it. So to think that someone is leading this country that's willing to stand up for the people of America and the people of the rest of the world at the same time, peace is good for everybody. We can engage in trade, we can have bilateral relations, we can all prosper as a result of the policies that we're trying to implement here in the United States of America. But again, in order to do that, there has to be an inherent level of occult mysticism and secrecy to all of it, because to just come out and throw all of your plans out on the table, it makes it very easy for the people that we're trying to defeat to try to overthrow that stuff and to push us in the direction that they want us to go. So, when it comes down to the, kind of what you were saying a moment ago, BB, the emotionality is what they're kind of counting on, that we're going to react in such a way and that we're immediately going to choose sides based upon the Hegelian dialectic, what it is they're presenting to us. This is the only choice that you have if you're going to play this game. But Donald Trump is kind of showing us a third way, a different way that can be good for every single one of us. And I think that a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of the secrecy and the occult nature of this stuff that we're dealing with, but I think that it's absolutely necessary, because I don't want these people to know everything that we're doing. I don't really want them to have the advantage of being able to overcome us if we're going to get to a certain point. And I think that's why Donald Trump is consistently keeping people global players kind of like rocked back on their heels, completely off their balance, so that when it gets to the point where we inject, what it is that we really want to do, then they get to the point where they have no choice but to capitulate and to take part in this new way.
You have a question?
Yeah.
So this question is for you guys, obviously, directing it to you, and maybe Matt can take the lead. I don't know if my question is relatable enough, but my grandfather, my German Jewish grandfather, was a colonel and the Wehrmacht in World War I. There was a certain corporal who was injured, released from the hospital, and became his adjutant or his orderly, and that was Adolf Hitler. As the story goes, grandfather died about 6 months before I was born, so I never had a chance to question him, because I did hear from my mom that he thought he was a decent guy. He was a hard worker, conscientious. So what in your minds, because I understand that I understand evil from a biblical perspective, and I understand that people outside of religious faith can still do good things, and they do often. But what do you feel was the evolution in the transformation of an Adolf Hitler from this, conscientious, hardworking infantry soldier and, serving my grandfather in that way to what he became later on? How was that done?
Well, I can say that, from what I understand about Adolf Hitler and his participation in World War I, he was very patriotic in terms of his love of Germany and the direction that he saw it going. He didn't care for that. And his evolution was based upon what he saw happening to Germany and the reasons behind it. And so, I think that you can take a look at any individual in the microcosm of a war. War is always going to be hell. People are going to be dying for this reason or that reason. And if you win the war, then you are the one with the moral imperative, and you were killing people for the right reason. But if you lose the war, then obviously you become vilified. And Adolf Hitler is very easy to vilify in terms of what happened during World War II. I've thought about this on a number of occasions, because I don't think Hitler thought of himself as a bad dude, right? I don't know that he was waking up every morning and thinking, okay, I'm just going to go kill a bunch of people, and it's because I simply hate people and I want to cause all this death. He was probably thinking that he was fighting for the survival of his country. And of course, looking back in retrospect, he becomes the villain of the story. America did bad things during World War II. Germany obviously did bad things during World War II. I don't know that there has ever been wars that have been fought where, technically war crimes weren't committed. But I think that anybody who willfully engages in the mass killing of millions of people, regardless of whether it was Germany or the many wars that have been fought since that time, I think that it's universally as evil. And I think that there's been this sort of twisting reconstruction of history to position what Germany did during World War II as the most evil act that you could ever possibly commit. But far more millions of people since that time have died. I think more Russians died during World War II fighting in World War II than died as a result of any other battles that took place, and that gets kind of whitewashed. People don't really talk about it. So I think that evil in this respect kind of becomes situational, which is, obviously very difficult to reconcile.
I think it was because he got kicked out of art school. It's crazy that that's actually an academically acceptable thing to say, eh? No, I think that it's a complex. Hitler was a complex mind. I don't think he was somebody who, and I don't think he was a good, high quality mind, but he had a complex personality type. And I do think that, he woke up in the morning thinking that he was saving his fatherland. He possibly believed he was the reincarnation of Odin. According to Carl Jung's assessment, he actually believed, he apparently believed that he was the avatar, not the reincarnation, the avatar of Odin, which is possible. There is something that my friend Uwe Alschner brought to my attention, who's a German researcher and a really good one at that, and he wrote an essay featuring an analysis of a painting that Hitler had done in 1912. And this particular painting had what looks to be a young Hitler sitting on a bridge, and it's a very peculiar rock bridge, which only exists in one place, rock for rock. It is that bridge that is in Exeter, England, right next to the town of Tavistock. It's called the Clapper Bridge. You can Google that. And this painting was discovered after World War II in Hitler's vaults. Now that puts Hitler in 1912, before World War I, with Rudolf Hess, who was also there, in a town next to Tavistock, which is the historic family town owned by the Russell family, aka Lord Bertrand Russell and clan, who was a leader of the Fabian Society, the same thing that Oswald Mosley later on was a leading member of. So that's what the Tavistock Clinic, people might know of the Tavistock Clinic, right? The thing that the gender realignment specialists of the world that also oversaw earlier on MK Ultra. It's the British Psychological Warfare Division that was set up in 1921 to investigate how to compartmentalize and fragment personalities to reconstruct them. And that was employed by the CIA after World War II. So this Tavistock town, this is before Tavistock Clinic or Institute was created. Hitler was right beside it. That's probably a thread that any serious researcher should probably pull on and try to investigate a little bit more to see what that was about. I would also say Hitler wrote at the end of Mein Kampf, he devoted it to Dietrich Ehret. Who is Dietrich Ehret? Dietrich Ehret is the head of the Thule Society, right? A follower of the writings of both Guido von List, a follower of Blavatsky, sort of the Aryan theosophists of Germany. And Hitler devotes it to him and describes how, or Dietrich Ehret had earlier, before he died in 23, described how he initiated Hitler into the secret doctrine, which is the name that Blavatsky gave to her work calling for the deconstruction of all existent religions and the creation of a new world religion based on a new high priesthood under her ISIS philosophy. So anyway, you got these really rich lines of research that are full of discoveries waiting to happen, but people are just not looking at that. Their brains have been sort of just cut off from it, so they're not going there even.
Another question?
Yeah. Oh.
Might have been the amphetamines.
Oh yeah, that probably helped too. Yeah. A lot of drugs.
Sorry, I hate to change the subject from Hitler, but
No, please.
where does Q fit into this?
Well, that's a good question, and we should address that. But real quick, I wanted to ask: wasn't Hitler assigned to infiltrate the Thule Society? Wasn't that what he was assigned to do wasn't he assigned to go infiltrate one of these political groups? As a soldier, and then he defected and went. I thought it was
he was never a member of the Thule Society. I know he was never.
Okay.
But I'm not. He could have been.
It might have just been the Nazi movement. But I do think that real quick on that, that's a really interesting thread, the Tavistock thing, and I would also argue,
Microphone, go.
I would also argue that that if Hitler escaped from that bunker, because a lot of people,
Which he did.
Argentina. Yeah, he lived out his days in Argentina.
A lot of people send me messages being like, "What about Hitler? What about Hitler? What about Hitler?" And if Hitler escaped from that bunker, all the people who are celebrating Hitler as the guy who was right, like the good guy in World War II who got a bad rap, if he escaped from that bunker, which it appears he did because of recently declassified documents via JFK file. That means that he was part of the op to destroy Europe, which is what World War II was. World War II was an operation to eviscerate European culture, Western culture. He was part of it, and that also means that he was in collusion with the Soviets, because the Soviets lied to everybody and said that they found him and they found his body, he had shot himself in the head in that bunker. So if he made his way to South America, then the Soviets were complicit in helping him escape. And and the CIA, which was operating heavily in South America throughout the 20th century, also understood that he was there the whole time and allowed him to live there. So that that truth, if that ends up being real, and I think it is, fundamentally changes the entire conversation regarding World War II and the history that we understand.
Well, there's also an argument to be made that this was a plan that was long in gestation, because they had set up these sort of economic lines into South America with the assistance of the Swiss banking industry very early on, and people had begun moving there early. And it's interesting because the Russians just published some images that are alleged to be Hitler's jawbones. But there's a bunch of dental work that I don't remember seeing in photographs and videos.
I'll talk. I want to grab the Q question. So
Well, hang on a second, because she asked, where does Q fit in?
yeah.
Lorraine has a follow-up Q question, so maybe we'll ask both of
go
them,
ahead.
and you guys can address.
Great. Really enjoying this conversation and discussion. Thank you. But I was thinking, in every session today, the same question, and it really relates to this talk about the Q operation. You were talking about how the secrecy and gaining advantage and how we're going to win this war. Are there other examples in history where revealing the matrix to people, revealing the manipulation, giving people information about how they've been being manipulated, has it ever been tried before, and what happened?
I would say no. I feel like this is totally unique. But I mean, if I may, just real quickly, how I think it fits in is, the revelation of all of this secret, behind the scenes occult information, because it, through the Socratic method, pointing out questions that we need to answer, led us into a bunch of different rabbit holes where, many of these subjects ended up becoming prominent.
Yeah, and ultimately there's a lot of dialogue in the Q kind of movement, and I think the Socratic method's a great one to highlight. It's funny that comes full circle of what we accidentally talked about at the beginning. I think it's worth questioning any of these things, the intention, right? That anchoring point. Why is this thing happening? And we've all probably heard like the counter argument to the Q operation is something called Operation Trust. I don't know how many people have kind of looked into this, but speaking of kind of the Proud Boys thing, it was a a different version of that, where this was in following the assassination of the czars in Russia. There was obviously a lot of sentiment in Russia, nationalist sentiment that was beloved of the czars and Orthodox Christian nationalism, and so people were upset. The Bolsheviks were not actually quite as popular as they like to say. It's because everybody who was not a Bolshevik ended up not being alive anymore. But Operation Trust was a move where, as the Bolsheviks were sort of getting into power, perceived power, they started infiltrating secret groups of patriots who were meeting in Russia, and it was called Operation Trust. And what would happen is you have a Russian patriot who would stand up in this anti-Bolshevik, pro-Orthodoxy meeting and say, okay, I hear what you're all saying, and you were all about to do whatever, do something. And I'm here to tell you that I'm in the military and we've got a plan, and if you just wait until this, we're gonna have a meeting about it next month, and then a meeting about it, and then a meeting about it, and then a meeting about it, and eventually we're gonna do something, but don't do anything yet. And the point of the operation was, first of all, those infiltrators would leave those meetings and dox every person that was in the meeting, so the Bolsheviks would kill them. They'd round them up and kill them, right? So those are the most activated patriots. It'd be the equivalent of infiltrating Badlands Media event, which definitely doesn't ever happen, and we definitely don't know that it happens and exactly who it is. But besides that, it would be like doing that and then being like, I totally like what you guys are doing, so here's all their names, here's what they were talking about, here's where they live, and rounding them all up, right? Now, say all that, I think it's good to consider and threat assess what we're being told. I don't think that the Q operation was an Operation Trust. I think people say that because there's the trust the plan rhetoric and all that kind of stuff. Why I don't believe it was a version of Operation Trust is the Socratic method. You get a lot of trust with me, ironically, real trust, when you operate that way. And I don't think it's just the Q drops that operated that way. I think Donald Trump operates that way a lot, where he puts something out, right? Besides in negotiations, he just seeds things constantly and throws things out into the public. Chris talks about this a lot, like beta testing. And I think what he's doing there is he's looking for consent. He's looking for feedback of saying, what do you guys think? What do you think about border security? What do you think about taxation? I think there's a plan. I think the drops were talking about a plan where I think maybe, I don't know if this is why the questions are coming up, but obviously we've been talking a lot lately where there's a subgroup of Q people who think we're not Q people or anti-Q because we don't personally like what we kind of think of as, or at least I think of as, staying in a circle of trust the plan, match drops to numbers. I think it's good to do that if you're then saying, okay, so what do you think about it, right? There was a 9 and a 9 and a 9. What do you think about it? What do you think that means? What do you think we should do? What do you think? What ideas do you want to talk about? And in some of the Q commentary, that's not what's happening. It's just, here's the pattern, here's the pattern, here's the pattern. It proves Q is real. It's like, okay, most of us believe that the Q stuff is real. What was the point of the Q drops? They tell you in it, right? Frame and support, like, you know, be the plan, move forward, first principles, spread, save and spread, like spread this information. So I think spreading the Q drops is good. I think that demonizing people who are not only doing that is where the problem comes in, and why I think you get some backlash from some people going, man, the way some Q people act, they're kind of acting like this is the only thing you should be talking about. If you're talking about anything else, you're not trusting the plan enough. And if you're questioning anything that's going on in the administration, clearly you didn't trust the plan. And we're being told to trust a plan by people who are interpreting the plan who don't know what the plan is. Right? It's like, even if it's a good plan, they don't know what it is. They do not know what the plan is. Yeah, so anyway, that's my very short response to that. Like the Q drops, but...
Well, you're asking me how does Q fit into this, and you know, on the last panel we talked about maneuver warfare, and you know, how does maneuver warfare work? As Oak told us, it works because the leader, the general, tells his subordinates what the end game is. Here's where we're trying to get to. Here's some guidance to help you along the way. But ultimately, maneuver warfare is about speed, it's about deception, and it's about being able to decentralize authority so that people can move quickly on the ground and not come back and ask for permission on what to do next. So if that is what maneuver warfare is, and you use maneuver warfare in order to avoid attrition warfare is whoever has the biggest, strongest army wins, and let's just go smash it out on the battlefield. Can't do that because of the numbers game. So yeah, seems like that's exactly what Q is meant for, right? Here's the end game, here's some guidance, go out into the field and maneuver and make your way to the end game. But you have to go out there and do it. This is not us doing it for you. This is not the generals out there telling you what to do. You have to go do it. Here's the end game. Here's a framework.
Hey, we got a comment over here, and then we're going to do closing thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah, this is actually a question because this is a battle. And those of us that believe know that it's more about the unseen than the seen. So this topic of geopolitics and the occult teach us lessons through history that was really fun to listen to you tease out. And I can't believe you couldn't remember his name. And you know, every good historian knows, it just rolls off their tongue. But what are the lessons for us? Because we are the warriors. We're the ones with the objective and the commander's intent. And we are in this battle space. And we, you know, if we believe this is about principalities more than it is the physical world, what are the lessons to avoid the traps that the occult can create? Because great power there, not good power, but power that has been used by small groups of people to derail humanity and try to do the things that destroy God's perfect will, and that is divide us and accuse us. What are the lessons from your knowledge of the occult and geopolitics that we need to take home to be warriors in this battle for our future?
So for me, pretty clearly, the greatest lesson is that, so I've seen a lot of people over the years suggest that because something is occult, you shouldn't research it at all, that you shouldn't understand it, you shouldn't try to understand it. But I think it's necessary to, especially when we're trying to dissect the actions and motivations of the people that we're actively fighting against. So just because knowledge is hidden doesn't necessarily mean that it is evil or that it's of ill intent. But oftentimes it can be. And if we don't understand what our enemies believe or what they're doing behind the scenes, then we will never have an accurate assessment of what exactly is going on. So for me personally, I think that it's to actively understand and research this stuff. Doesn't mean that you have to internalize it. It doesn't mean that you have to believe it. It doesn't mean that it has to become part of your own personal framework. But just to know what is out there and what these people are doing, I think that that is invaluable.
Yeah, it seems to me that, and I hope, Oak and General Quas, I hope I'm not getting this wrong as a layman, but at some point in maneuver warfare, you do move to attrition warfare when you engage the enemy. It is ultimately about winning a battle and winning the conflict. And so I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to ultimately shift from a maneuver warfare mentality to an attrition warfare mentality, and that would be by awakening enough people where the moral righteousness of our society elevates to a position where people see things for what they are, and they are no longer entrapped by the psyops. They're no longer baited by the shiny objects. And I wonder, how do we get there? I think establishing those objectives are really important. We're not going to accomplish that necessarily in this moment, but focusing on the principles and focusing on developing our own understanding of what morality is and how we can engage in these issues and where we set the narrative and we set the parameters of a discussion rather than just reacting to every single narrative they throw out and reacting to headlines and reacting to bait that is dangled in front of us. I think we then become the infinite player, Burning Bright, in the game theory, and are no longer reacting all the time to what they're manipulating us into doing.
Yeah, I would add my considerations on that. When you know your history, you're going to be a lot less inclined to screw up the way people in the past had screwed up when a similar situation emerges hitting your society, right? So you really do have to know the as truthfully as possible the core drama, like the core dramas that give you the best universal lessons into the crisis that we're currently facing, because nothing new is under the sun, right? In many ways, the iterations are different, the form is different, but the principles are the same principles. And this oligarchy this doesn't directly address that particular question, but I'll get at it my way in a lateral fashion. But the oligarchy it's not like they only just all of a sudden wanted to have a totalitarian feudal system of controls forever, right? It's like they've always wanted that. That's been their constant desire and intention. And on a number of measurable occasions throughout history, the hammer has come down. Like they put their actions, their plans into motion and tried to finalize it on several observable, provable occasions throughout history, and 3 in the 20th century alone. They tried to finalize a new world order. They tried to get their one world government under eugenics priesthood in place. It was subverted. How was it subverted? Well, it didn't happen through just one lone person emerging on the scene. You did have heroes, but you had a coherent conspiracy for the good. People were able to get their shit together and organize, and it did involve military and intelligence factors as well as civilian, but you had people who were able to, under Warren Harding, right, subvert the League of Nations push for world government in 1923. In 1933, there was another attempt to get a one world government under the League of Nations and the Bank of England and the Bank of International Settlements, subverted because the US delegations were all pulled out of it, and it sabotaged that conference. It was tried again under the Nazi fascist operation. And so I think it's important to look at how were these things sabotaged by patriots. So there is a certain amount of precedent to what a previous speaker was alluding to. And number 2 is I think we should expect more of the policies. Like I'm not seeing as much as I would like to see, and around the concrete policies that were able to break up the Wall Street banks at times when they were about to consolidate a world regime 80 years ago. These banks were, hundreds of bankers were pulled into court. J.P. Morgan Jr. was pulled into court in 1934, and he was forced. J.P. Morgan Bank was forced under public scrutiny to be audited, and they had to be. It was proven how they manufactured the Great Depression, which was a giant wealth transfer, kind of like today, right? Using similar principles of building up a bubble out of thin air on speculation, kind of like today. That was then popped, kind of like today, and so you could have resolved that chaos of the Great Depression by going fascist, like Europe did, or you could restore the American system, as did happen, which did involve Glass-Steagall breaking up the banks, the reassertion and control of productive credit, like real tangible things with a vision for the 4 pillars that animated these vast mega projects that rehabilitated industry and farming and gave people hope for the future again. Like that's what was done that allowed America the strength to build itself up to go and put down the Wall Street, London-funded fascist machine. We did that. Great. But like I'm not seeing enough of those principles being invoked today. I don't see the vision. I see protectionism, and that's good. But I don't see the vision yet. I don't see the actual call to restore Glass-Steagall the way Trump did in 2016. I think we need that sooner than later, Because if the chaos happens and the banks get ripped to shreds and we don't have something in place to protect the civilians and the real economy, it could be, so much damage could be done to the nation and the world that won't be easy to fix. So for me, that's something I would like to see a lot more of in the Patriot community, is discussions like that, I guess.
You're not trusting the plan hard enough, man.
Yeah, I guess.
I'll use this answer as answer and my closing thoughts on this. I would say that to what you can forward and take control here is watch the Dark Knight trilogy and think of this discussion, because what Bruce Wayne does in that series is he is actually indoctrinated, if you remember, into the League of Shadows by Ra's al Ghul. And Ra's al Ghul tells him that the ultimate form of power projection, after teaching him kinetic, clandestine, financial, he teaches him every form of power projection. And at the end, he says, you're still never going to have any power until you learn the final lesson, which is that an idea cannot be killed. And the League of Shadows is not a man, it's an idea. So what Bruce Wayne does when he discovers the intentions of that secret society, the League of Shadows, is he actually uses their core governing principle against them and inverts it. And that's what Batman is, right? It's a symbol of somebody standing up against the League of Shadows, and it's this first principle where that's the deployment, right? Like the deployment in those movies isn't about stopping crime fighters and or stopping crime and arresting people and that sort of thing. It's becoming a symbol and using a lot of the lessons learned from the occult and from the way these people operate in the shadows in order to forward the opposite thing. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about Donald Trump, plans that people think may or may not be going on, the Q drops, all this kind of stuff, to me, it looks like the reverse engineering of what the enemy has been doing to us for so long, except orbiting around the ideas, the core ideas of sovereignty, individualism, manifest destiny, like all these kinds of things, and belief in God, belief in goodness. So, becoming a symbol of that, orienting yourself. What's your ideal? What is your purpose? What are you doing? As corny as it sounds, if you don't have that, then you're really just being spun in a void of other people's ideas.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good job, guys.